Do you find that it's difficult for you to walk away from temptation? Do you feel that you try and be quote unquote really good only to end up binging or eating compulsively and then feeling guilty and shameful and then just kind of circling around that time and time again? When we experience these behaviors, it can be really tricky to stay on track, and it doesn't matter how much we know. It doesn't matter even if we know exactly what we need to do to eat the right things and support our body. If we can't do that consistently because we're struggling with our mindset, with our relationship with food and compulsive or emotional eating, then we're never going to get anywhere. But today I've got the wonderful Harriet Morris on the podcast, and she's got such an interesting insight into why this happens and what's going on internally. And I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure you'll find it fascinating too. So I hope you find this episode helpful, and let's dive in. So happy to have you here. Perhaps you could start off by talking us through what your background is, what it is you do, and kind of how you came to work in this area.
Thank you, Louisa. Well, I am the eating coach, and up until 2012, I was a compulsive sugar addict. I binged to deal with life, and then I had a lot of hormonal disturbance, a lot of really bad PMT, and I had to make some changes. But it's not like today, there was no help then in those days. I just had to do it myself, and I managed to give up sugar in 6 weeks, and I had no willpower, I had no self-belief. I had no help, but I turned it into an experiment, and it changed my life. I felt like a different person. And then I trained in eating psychology, and I started coaching binge eaters and sugar addicts in 2014. And and here I am now. And now I'm also working with people with type 2 diabetes. So it's wonderful work. It's a very different approach to the mainstream. It's not for everyone, but it is interesting, and I think there's a lot of crossover with what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's so interesting that you came into it from personal experience and that you turn things around so quickly. It sounds like, 6 weeks is such a short amount of time to kind of get in control of things. So you spoke about being a compulsive sugar addict. So what does that actually mean? What's compulsive eating?
So, as I see it, compulsive eating is when people are trying to deal with other issues in their life by using food. And what happens is that they start off with deprivation. And the people I coach have got a very strong inner energy, I call the inner food rebel. And so, what happens is that for a few days or a few weeks, or maybe even a few hours for some people, a few months for others, they're very good, and a lot of people I coach are women, and it's about being a good little girl. This is the way they go into, and then their inner food rebel says, "You're a woman. I'm not putting up with this." And the inner food rebel demands that we have pleasure, and pleasure is linked to survival. All the things that have kept our ancestors alive in Paleolithic times, including eating, but if you think about exercise, sex, and social bonding, they kept those people alive. And so Mother Nature, evolution, has made those things pleasurable. Well, they should be. And so what happens is when you go to this deprivation stage, your cave brain, as I call it, your primitive brain says, wait a minute, we haven't got any pleasure. This is dangerous. So we need some pleasure. And then the inner food rebel says, you're a woman. I get thee to the dessert aisle because I need you to reclaim your power. And it just does it in like a really bad way. It's like a teenager who's bullied and decides that the only course of action is to burn the school down. So it's about managing those energies of the excess and the deprivation. I don't know if my hands are going the right way on Zoom. And stilling that metronome of excess, deprivation, excess. And so that people can actually start to manage issues in their life directly, and basically put food out of a job, but while still being able to enjoy food and actually enjoy food more.
That's so interesting. And You know, you don't think of it like that as in terms of this need for pleasure in your
Yeah.
life. And does that mean that when people are trying to be quote unquote good and eat well, that's something that can potentially set them up to do more compulsive eating because of that
Yes,
deprivation of
they
pleasure?
what they're doing is they're not only removing pleasure, but they think that there's some kind of balancing going on. They think that I've been really bad and now I must be good, and it balances things out. But as I've just explained, the inner food rebel is having none of that. So you go to excess, and it's what I call fake pleasure. So I see pleasure in terms of real pleasure and fake pleasure. And the difference is that when you do something that gives you real pleasure, such as to go for a walk in nature, or have a phone call with a friend, or eat an actually nutritious meal, you feel good. And then afterwards, guess what? You feel good. There's no price tag. With fake pleasure, you can feel amazing. I remember when I used to go and eat loads of chocolate. The pleasure was amazing, but afterwards, the price tag of the guilt, the shame, the bloating, the mood swings, the price tag was enormous. So real pleasure has no price tag. Fake pleasure, it's too big, as I'm sure you'll know from your work with clients.
Yeah, that's such an interesting way of looking at it. And I'm sure many people listening can really relate to that experience of kind of eating really well perhaps and feeling quite virtuous and feeling like they have earned an indulgence and then indulging, then feeling
Yeah,
guilty and bad and just swinging between the two.
absolutely.
So there's a big part of that, I think, is how we look at food and our beliefs around food. So with that being said, how do we start to kind of unpick that and start to get kind of more on an even keel?
So yes, it's interesting. One of the things in my training I was taught, and I think this is so true, is that one of the functions of compulsive eating or binge eating, they are the same thing, is that you are trying to get balance in your life. Something is out of whack. So it may be that you're in a marriage that you hate, but you don't feel you can leave. It may be that you don't feel valued at work. It may be childhood trauma, a lot of things. And so that it's like something you're close too tight because you haven't managed to deal with it. And then so the compulsive eating, or indeed sugar addiction, is a way to find like a kind of psychological homeostasis, like a kind of a balance. So I think your question is, well, what do we do if we haven't got food to do this really, really rubbish job for us?
Mm.
What do we do instead? And so the way I work with people is, what we're doing is, first of all, on the level of, but Harriet, I just want to stop eating the sugar. I'm pre-diabetic, or I can't stand this. The power that I feel it has over me. What we do is we do an experiment, and we do very low commitment, and I give them ways that they can walk away from sugar. I can share that with your listeners, if one of them, the one that worked for me in 2012. So what they do with that is they can prove to themselves in a very short amount of time that they can make a change, and it doesn't have to be about wearing a nutritional hair shirt and trying to be a good little dieter. You can do it in a more empowered way. And at the same time, um, one concept one principle really, is called future focus. So instead of going, I must fix my binge eating and I must change things, you say, where do I want to be? How do I want to relate to how I'm eating every day? And then you get your behavior to align with that, rather than trying to fix something. It's the difference between going down the road towards the health that you want and staying in this sort of hellish place where you're forever trying to fix something. Because if you're trying to fix it all the time, you need it to be there to be fixed. I don't know if I'm getting a little bit abstract here. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely it does. We can get ourselves in a absolute funk, I think, and end up in a place where we're almost chasing our tail
Yeah.
and swinging from one issue to another and never really getting to the root of the problem. And it sounds like you're talking about partly getting to the root of the problem, but thinking about the bigger picture and rather
Yeah.
than trying to solve the smaller issue of finding yourself at the chocolate covered, however often, instead focusing on that bigger picture and that bigger goal. Is that right?
That's absolutely it. And it's really interesting when you're saying about, you said get to the root of the problem, because we have in our culture, we really do have a, I must understand the backside of my problem. I must dig down and I must solve my childhood, because for so many of my clients, I will say that they had, food was used as a punishment. They had their mothers taking them to diet clubs at the age of 10. It's like, oh, so that causes me pain when I
Mm.
hear that. And they think they need to excavate their childhood in order to be free of the food issues that they have. And there is a place for saying, do you think that might be, is there some dots to connect here if they haven't seen them? But what I have found is wonderful is that you can still free yourself from using food as your life manager and sugar as your life manager, even if you haven't sorted any of problems out in your from your childhood, because let's face it, we can't go back and do it again. With this future focus idea, it is very exciting, because when you're focused there, what's happened behind you does become, it's less, how shall I say, pressing. There's less room for victim thinking and more room for thinking, right, what do I do today? What's the one thing I can do today that will move me forward? And that's a much more empowering, exciting way to live your life, I think.
Yeah, I always think that life coaching is a much more empowered approach where you're thinking about the future rather than the more psychotherapy counseling
Yes.
approach, which is much more about kind of dredging through the past. And like you say, there is definitely a place for it and it is necessary in some cases. But I think for some people, it can be, well, probably for everyone, is very challenging to go through that and dig all that up, and to hear that actually you can move forwards without doing that, I think is probably quite a relief for someone listening who is struggling with these types of issues.
Yes, and I'm thinking of the work that you do. That must there's a very big puzzle piece with that as well, isn't it? When I did this experiment in 2012, because my life had become unlivable, and my children were 6 and 3 at the time, and they were scared of me. It was like, what is happening? And just taking this hormone havoc wreaker and this mood swing nightmare out of my life, changed so much. I thought I was like psychologically broken, and I had to think and have therapy and read all these self-help books, when actually I just needed to stop wrecking my my inside the systems and my mind and body with something that I just couldn't cope with.
Yeah, it's such a complex issue really, isn't it? Because it's all well and good knowing what you need to do, but you've got to be able to implement it. And when you're
Yeah.
struggling with, whether it's physical symptoms of something like chronic fatigue or perimenopause or whatever it might be, or whether it's more psychological struggles around your relationship with food, they're all things that kind of get in the way of you actually implementing what you
Yes.
intend to do. And, you talk about how you were a compulsive sugar addict and you managed to turn things around. So I'd love to hear more about how you actually did that. Was it as simple as getting sugar out, or was there more to it than that?
Well, I think I can only unpick it by just, if I can tell you a very brief story. So yeah, I realised that all was hell inside me, and that it was around my PMT, or PMS for American listeners. So I went to the doctor and I said, I'm in hell. And she had me on a very low dose hormonal contraception. And I said, take it out. I feel like I'm going crazy here. And she said to me, well, it's only a tiny dose. And I said, not for me. So she said, okay. And I said, listen, doctor, I said, I've heard that if I gave up alcohol, sugar, and coffee for a month, it might really help my my periods and how crazy I've been feeling. And I'll never forget this, Louise. She looked right down her nose at me and she went, "Well, you can certainly try that." And I thought, right, lady, you're on. And she didn't know this, but she helped me so much because I thought, I've got no idea. I eat sugar every day. I can't live without it. But I looked at my kids and then I thought of her and I thought, right. So what I did, and this was the thing, I did an experiment. I thought, okay, I'm going to wait till first day of my period and I am going to cut out 95% of the sugar. So all the things I was addicted to, you know, the cakes, the ice creams, the biscuits, the chocolate especially. I did keep some things in like curry sauces and mayonnaise because you can't really binge on those. And I allowed myself to have replacements. So I had health bars, which were just sweetened with dates. I remember I had them. And then every day it was like, can we do this? Shall we see? It wasn't, I have to be really good and never again for the rest of my life. That was super important because the addict in me would never, and the inner food rebel in me, they would never have accepted that that was it, even though it actually was it. So every day I would have my replacements. And when I got a craving, I came up with something called cravings busters. And a craving buster it's a behavior that you do which is it actually takes some of your attention and it's so interesting that the craving will pass. So would you like me to share the one that worked
Yeah,
for me?
absolutely.
Okay, so I call it text salvation. So we didn't have all the internet that we've got then, but I did have text messages. It sounds like the Middle Ages, doesn't it? 2012. Anyway, I had a friend who was sympathetic to what was going on for me and I said, listen, is it all right with you if I text you whenever I get a craving? Now, I was really clear. She didn't have to text me back. You don't want to put that pressure on anybody. But so it would go like this. I would find myself, Louise, funnily enough, I'd go to the supermarket for some fruit and veg. And then, do you know what? I was in the dessert aisle. How did that happen? And so what I would do, I'd get out my phone and I'd say, hello, it's Harriet. I'm in the dessert aisle. I really, really, really want some sugar. I will text you in 5 minutes. Send. And then I said to myself, right, you can have as much as you want in 5 minutes. Walk away now and let's see what's happened. And because I'd made this commitment and it was about the human connection, it wasn't about I must be a good girl. It was about I have made this commitment to somebody who's sympathetic. So I wandered off and then I was so pleased with myself that I'd actually walked away from the sugar aisle that I didn't go back. And I was like, wow. And I did that every day, probably sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. And this went on for 6 weeks. And something happened to me it was about the middle of the 6th week. And I woke up one day and my inner food rebel, right, we've had enough of this. Come on. My inner food rebel went, right, okay, I am sick of this and we're going back. You can't manage without sugar, Harriet. And I went, great. Oh, because it's such hard work. Oh, yeah, that's it. I'm giving up. So I went right down to the supermarket and I stood there in the aisle and I was like, this is just, oh, what shall I have? What shall I have? I'm going to take my time. And the funny thing was, so I stood there and as I was deciding, and I couldn't decide, my feet, and this is no word of a lie, it felt like they had a mind of their own. They turned and started to walk away. And because I'm attached to my feet, I went as well. I went, what was going on? And I realized what was going on. I had trained my unconscious mind that the response to a craving, I'd retrained it. So the response to a craving used to be, oh, well, you go and get the sugar and stuff your face with it. Now the response was, get a craving, you get your phone out, you text your friend and you walk away. And what I did on that day, even though I skipped the getting the phone out, probably because I was still standing there, my unconscious, and I'm not using this in a woo, when you get mind readers on stage. I'm talking about it's the operating system that just means that we know how to use a word processor. and we can drive without thinking about it. It's your automatic operating system.
Mm.
I trained my automatic operating system that you get a craving, you walk away. And my feet, it's like that was what was in control of my feet. So I walked out of the supermarket and two things happened. Part of me was really annoyed because I wanted to go back to my sugar, my darling sugar. But the other part of me was like, that's amazing. I am never going back. I had trained myself so it was automatic. So do you see? It was like, it wasn't about willpower. It wasn't about being good and about being committing. It was about, by hook or by crook, just getting myself to walk away from the sugar for a few weeks.
Mm.
And at some point it became automatic. And I've had tastes of sugar and things like that since, but it makes me do this. It's too
Yeah.
much. And I have been free ever since that wonderful day in the dessert aisle.
That's amazing. Well, congratulations. It's an incredible achievement. And it really sounds like you're basically reconditioning your brain to,
Yeah.
when you get a craving, just have a different behavior that comes as a
Yes.
result of that craving. And
Yes.
I've heard of that technique before where you kind of say to yourself, okay, give it 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And if I've still got the craving after that, then do what you want, have the sugar, but just give it 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And for many people, in those 10 minutes, you've distracted yourself with something else or made a better choice to kind of get that pleasure. So yeah, it's a really interesting strategy that can work really well. And it's interesting to hear your experience of it and how it resulted in you, walking away from the sugar on autopilot, because
Yes.
that is what we need, isn't it? To be able to
Yeah.
sustain something, we need to be able to start doing these habits or behaviors unconsciously. We just need to be doing them
Yes.
without having to make a
Yes.
decision about it.
Yes. And what I believe is that so there's, I don't know if you've heard this book, Atomic Habits.
Hmm.
It's a massive multi-million seller and everything. And that's great. But what I find is that when people have an inner rebel that desperately thinks that for your own good, you need to hang on to the habit, we need to get a bit crafty and creative. It's like having a toddler inside you that, well, I want it this way. And the toddler says, look, why don't we go and take all the flowers up? Because that would be fun. Because I think, but instead of it being fun, that inner toddler is saying, because you really need it, I'm going to help you. And so instead of going, no, toddler, we're not going to do this, because this toddler inside you is quite powerful. What you do is you go, oh, well, we could do that, but hey, look over there. I think there's a rabbit over there. That's what you do with the toddler. But in my case, my equivalent of the rabbit over there was, I'll text my friend, and that really helped me. It was the connection there, and just the micro commitment of 5 minutes. It had to be interesting enough to overcome the programming of my inner food rebel, really.
I think those micro commitments can be really powerful. Something that I've seen work with some people is on a different topic, but for people who are trying to get active but find that they always put it off or make excuses, just committing to doing something really small, like putting on their gym clothes or
Yes.
doing 2 minutes of exercise, usually it leads to them doing 10, 20 minutes of exercise. But if you just commit to doing that really tiny thing, then first of all, you win and you feel that sense of achievement, even if that's all you did. And it's almost like, from what you described, the process that you went to it through, it's almost like you need to prove to yourself that you can follow through and kind of display some self-discipline.
Yes, well, I've my inner food rebel would be like, no, self-discipline, no, we can't do that, and I created a whole narrative about I had none. But what did sort of light my fire was that I came up with this principle called actions change beliefs. So there's a I think it's a big myth in personal development that, if you change your belief, if you just believe you can do anything. And first of all, I don't think it's true. I'm 53, Louise. And if I just decided that I wanted to do the next Olympics, I could believe as much as I want. It ain't happening. But let's do something silly, Harriet, and talk about something like giving up sugar, because the people I work with, they've had so many bad experiences before they come to me. They can't rely on belief, but if you change it round, instead of going just believe in yourself and your behaviour will change, I go, can you just change your behaviour this much, and then you can surprise yourself, and then you can start to change your belief system. So it was those constant actions. Every time walking away, 5 minutes, text my friend, go and have a replacement, text my friend, etc. And I played little games with myself, like I double dare you. I double dare you to do another day on this experiment, and things like that. And that's what changed my belief. It wasn't the other way around.
I love this because it's so practical and something
Mm.
that listeners can so easily implement in, various areas of their life, whether that's to do with eating less sugar or whatever it might be. So, on the topic of eating less sugar, are there other strategies that we can employ to reduce our sugar intake or manage it better?
So, for example, people are going to be meeting sugar challenges everywhere because it is everywhere. And one thing I do, if one of my clients is going out for a meal, I say, well, let's look at their website. Let's decide what you're going to have. Another thing people can do to plan ahead. If there's an event where it's not like a sit down meal, but there may be a buffet, and so that's something that people might have or might not have, I get them to have a really big nutritious meal, plenty of protein, plenty of healthy fats before they go. So they're actually physically full. And other things that people can do are, for example, it may be, this is something that when people have sugar in the house, cookies in the house, I have met an awful lot of resistance. I'm really interested in what you have found yourself, but that I say to clients, okay, so the biscuits are a problem. Shall we just get rid of them? And they go, no, my husband likes them. Okay. And I'll try and coach them about not having it there. And they can't do anything about that. They think they can't do anything about that. And I say, well, can you make it harder? Can you make it harder to access that junk food? And just explain, and try and get your husband to work with you on this. So it's really interesting, like putting food at the back of the garage where it's really hard to get to. You'll have somebody who's like, I'm so compulsive, I can't manage without the biscuits. And then I'll speak to them next week and I say, how was it when you put the biscuit jar at the back of the garage too high up and you had to get a step ladder and you had a craving at 10 o'clock at night? They were like, yeah, couldn't actually be bothered. So they prove to themselves that it's not, food hasn't got this power. Food hasn't got any power. Sometimes I make a joke and I'll get a bag of sugar. I don't never use it, but I just as a thing, as a demo, I'll put it on the table and then I'll get a knife and I'll put it next to it and I'll say, shall we see how dangerous the sugar is? And we wait and obviously nothing happens, and I say that sugar can't do anything to you. It's people that I don't believe people have a relationship with food. I think they use food to mediate their relationship with themselves, with their inner food rebel, with the inner critic and everything. So
It's definitely a challenge that I see in my clients when someone in the household has their biscuits or their chocolates. And when they're there, it can be very difficult to avoid eating them because you kind of start off by thinking, oh, well, I'll just have one. And then one turns into two
yeah.
and so on. I'm interested to hear what you advise to, and maybe it's the same thing, to your clients who talk about their children's snacks and how they have to buy the ice creams or the packs of sweets or the crisps for their children and that they can't not buy them. So it's difficult for them to avoid temptation. So I'd be interested to hear what you would
Yes.
say to that.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think the honest truth is if they have a partner, I have clients and their partner also has an issue with sugar, and the partner is using the children as an excuse to have the sugar in the house. And I will say that's quite a difficult situation to deal with. However, if you have somebody where they don't have another adult who's on really wants to keep the sugar there, I think it really depends on the age of the children. So younger children, I would just not buy the things and say, and then when they're 3 and 4, you can say things like, there wasn't any, and maybe you can't go shopping with them. Maybe you need to get an online shop, and that can be convenient. And I have people say, yes, but it's inconvenient. And I'm like, yep, this is a really big thing. You're going to have to do inconvenient things. When they're older and they start having a mind of their own, oh dear. Well, when they have a mind of their own, then you can start to, I find with my kids, I negotiate with them, because I'm a single mum and they stay with their dad, and their dad has, he just will feed them rubbish. And then they go out, they go to their friends, they go to school. They're teenagers now, my boys are. And you realise that you can't control everything. And so it's about sort of negotiating with them and saying, I want you to try this. What I do with my kids is I never force them, because I've heard so many horror stories from clients. I never force them to, like, you eat this. But I'll say, I'd like you to have a bite of this. And I think over time, hopefully, that will happen. There's lots of things I make they don't like. It's not, I could never, Louise, I could never coach anybody on how to get their kids to be super healthy. I just couldn't. I'm a single mum. I'm busy. My kids are now, one's nearly 19 and the other is nearly 16. So it is a challenge in the world that we live in. But you can negotiate with them. You could, like, we don't have desserts in the house. If it's their birthday, and if they go on holiday, I say you can buy whatever cereal you like, but they just know that there's no sugar there. I think that would be my number one tip for anybody who is worried about the amount of sugar their kids eat, is just don't have it in the house. And they may well kick up a fuss, but let them kick up a fuss. And you're showing them that this is what happens in your home, and that there isn't anything wrong with sugar. Like Robert Lustig, who's this world authority on sugar, he says, I'm okay with desserts sometimes. He says, but I'm not okay with dessert for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, with all of the high carb sugar things. So I think that is it. And the second thing that's just occurred to me is cooking. Is you can just, when it says you need 100 grams of sugar, you do 50 grams or 40 grams of sugar, and then there are lots of replacements that you can make. And kids can be very difficult, teenagers even worse, but it's about just showing up and saying we're doing this. But I will say, the younger you can change what's going on in the house, the better, really. When my kids were really little, I was still a sugar addict, and I wish I had a time machine to go back, and I would do things very, very differently. But there you go. Retrospect, was it? Retrospect is a wonderful thing, or something.
Hindsight. Yeah.
Hindsight, yes, yeah.
Yeah, this is a whole big topic that we could get into around, how to work with your kids, but we won't get into it because we'd be here all day. But it is interesting to hear you talk about that, because I see it as a lot of women use it as an excuse to keep those sweet treats in the house. And the reality is, particularly if your kids are young, they're going to get over it really quickly once you stop buying them. You don't need to buy it for them, and they don't need those foods. So that's kind of like the bottom line.
A really interesting fact, it's quite a scary fact that I read about type 2 diabetes, which, it's massive, it's quadrupled over the last 40 years, is that in adults, it takes 10 to 13 years to develop. And I'm not sure what age it was they're talking about, but in children and young people, it can develop in, this is it, 21 months. That somebody did a study, and it was, and I'm sorry, I can't remember for the life of me, but it was 21 months, because I think it's to do with cell renewal in younger people. But that is what's really scary. So for us older people over the age of 18, there's some quite good news about diabetes, which that it's a long road and you can do a U-turn anytime. But if you're letting your kids have too much sugar, what are you doing to them? Are they going to be in that 21 months group? And I think that is a really sobering thought that hopefully might steer some people away from the dessert aisle.
Mm, yeah, and children or people are getting diagnosed at younger and younger ages. It used to be something that we called age onset diabetes
Yeah,
because it was something that older people got. But
yeah,
now, people in their teens and their early 20s are being diagnosed
yeah,
with diabetes as a result of overconsumption of sugars and processed foods in the diet, and
yeah.
lots of other things like inflammation and various other factors that play a role. So yeah, definitely an important topic to get into. Now, before we wrap up for today, I know that you've got some stuff that could be helpful for our listeners. So perhaps you could just tell us how people can connect with you and how they can kind of dip their toe into your world.
Okay, yes, so I have the Eating Coach podcast. So if you just put Eating Coach into wherever you get your podcasts. I also have a short Freedom from Sugar course based on what I did in those 6 weeks in 2012. But what I'd like, this is an offer for your listeners, is I'm going to give a free sample of that so you can have a look. So you just need to go to theshiftinside.com/try freedom, and then you'll be able to see if the ideas in the taster work for you. And then a second gift for your listeners, I've got a special coupon with some money off if they want to buy the course. It's not massively expensive because some things I do cost more because it's a one-to-one with a lot of energy on my part. But I also think that people in my position, because I have got quite uncommon knowledge, I should be giving away some things that people can go and use that's available to everyone. So that's theshiftinside.com/try freedom,
Perfect.
and
And
you get that.
we'll include that link in the show notes as well.
Cheers.
And what about on socials? Can people connect with you on Instagram and Facebook?
Yes, I'm on Instagram. I'm not, I must say, I'm not on Instagram very much. What I've done is I've set up an account called Mind Over Type 2, where I'm playing around with, so some of the visuals there are a little bit confrontative towards the sugar industry. So go and have a look at that if you want to. I spend much more time on my podcast, but I am starting to do some YouTube videos. So I'll give you some links so they can go and look at some YouTube videos as well as the podcast and Instagram. So,
Awesome. Yes. So make sure you check out the show notes if you're listening. All right. Well, thank you so much, Harriet. It's been so interesting. I feel like we could have talked for hours
yeah.
and really gone into these topics much more, but I feel like we've touched on them enough for people to be able to take some steps in the right direction, which is the most important thing. So thank you again.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, Louise.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I really hope that you enjoyed this one and that you've walked away with some helpful tips on how to reduce your sugar intake or at least walk away from temptation. If you are enjoying this podcast, then make sure you hit follow or subscribe on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you've got a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you left a review on Apple Podcasts. If you've got a question for the podcast, or if you've got a topic that you'd like me to go through, then why not head on over to speakpipe.com/Louise Digby, where you can leave me a voice note, or feel free to ping me a message on Instagram by searching at Louise Digby Nutrition. Thank you so much again, and I'll see you in the next one.